working on reform, like trying to change the election process so that it's more fair, or you're running as a candidate outside, not endorsed by either party, there's a lot of institutional barriers to success. So even if voters may want it, or you may have a candidate that's more representative, it's very difficult to win in the political industry because there's all kinds of things you don't think about that it takes to be successful in politics. This really is the first time groups that are working on reforms, often who don't agree with each other, have gotten together to say, hey, none of us want to form another party, but we need to have a table that we're able to sit at, talk about how we can build some institutional assets ourselves, and awareness and discussion amongst each other, so that we're learning from it and leveraging each other's resources, and it's not trying to take on a whole system one little pea shot at a time. Let's build the relationships, have the conversations, and set the conditions for a big idea to happen.
So many people from so many different walks of life don't like the parties, they don't like partisanship, they don't like the way the political process is working, and independents becoming organized are a force for structural reform and systemic change. So that's what we do. It might be the most important thing that's happening in the country today, more important than the 2020 presidential election.
Change Illinois is the Coalition for Honest and New Government Ethics. I feel like I've made several dozen new mentors, and that's something you really can't put a price on.
We are the first state in the nation to use ranked choice voting in state primaries and in federal elections. And then this year, we got ranked choice voting passed for President of the United States. So in November of 2020, Maine will be the first place in the nation ever where voters can use ranked choice voting in voting for president. So they're going to be able to vote for the person that they like the most without fear of electing the person that they like the least. And nobody's going to feel like their vote is wasted. And so we're pretty proud of that. And we're really hoping that we have lit a spark for the rest of the country.
Hi, everyone. This is Jackie Salit from Independent Voting, and it's great to be here with all of you. For those of us that were together in Denver at this time last year, drinking bourbon samples in the lobby of the Oxford Hotel and feeling pretty good about our prospects overall, it's sobering, isn't it, to look back and to take in the magnitude of the calamity that hit our country and everywhere in the world, literally within weeks of when we each got home. Unfortunately, the pandemic is still raging. And so we're doing this meeting this year on Zoom, and we're not able to spend time in the hallways and in the bar cooking up schemes and partnerships and competitions with one another. Hopefully by this time next year, we'll be able to meet in person. And I pledge to you today that if we do, I will buy everyone a drink so that we can celebrate that we are together again. Many of you probably know that this week is the 40th anniversary of the day that John Lennon was shot and killed outside of his apartment in New York City. This was about 10 blocks from where I grew up. And so they're playing Beatles songs and John Lennon songs everywhere you go. And the other day I heard one that really landed for me, and it actually made me think about all of you and all of us and the work that we're doing. It's the song, Don't Let Me Down. I think most of you know it. Don't let me down. Don't let me down. Yeah, we had some copyright issues, or I would have cut it right into the video directly. But the reason that I like this song and that I think it resonated for me is that I think if the American people could be here with us today, that's what they would be saying to us. Don't let me down. Don't let us down. The American political system is in so much trouble, and we need people who can chart a new pathway for us to get us out of this situation where partisanship and corruption and demonization rules. So let's not let them down. And let's keep building and doing all the wonderful work that people do. So have a happy holiday. Really great to be here with you, and I'll see you on Zoom. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Jackie. Great, as always, to hear from you. Our next speaker is Charles Munger Jr. Charlie was very active and engaged in the top 2 primary reform in California, not only getting it passed, but also evaluating its effectiveness and making sure we're all aware of the impact it's had in California so that it not only continues there, but can be a catalyst for reforms elsewhere. Charles, the floor is yours.
Where to go from success with nonpartisan elections and instant runoff in Alaska? Imagine a national organization must respond to a challenge. Each chapter will send one delegate to a national convention to approve a policy. Before you is a slide that shows that for one hypothetical 200-person chapter is a histogram, the level of response to this challenge each member thinks is appropriate. That runs along the vertical axis. 3 people, named A, B, and C, asked to be the delegate for this chapter. Looking at the histogram of the members' opinions and the level of response that each person running favors, who do you think should be the delegate? Clearly, in my view, B. 80% of the members think A's level is too low, and another 80% think C's level is too high. B's level is at the just right 50-50 point, and at the peak of the distribution of the members' opinion as well. It turns out, if we run an election with ranked choice ballots, that whether B will in fact win depends on what system of elections is used to take the ballots and declare the winner. Some systems will always elect B in this circumstance, and some systems will never elect B. This is a big choice. If you choose a system that never elects B, then, if A and C know that if they get in the race, then selecting B is impossible, you will install a low-level, high-level political duopoly in this chapter, and just right candidates not only won't win, they won't choose to run. Also, if A and B only were in the race, we will note, then B would win this race by almost 2-1. But if A can get C to run, A's chances to win would soar. Whether C, in being persuaded to run, would be sincere or a shill acting in A's interest is irrelevant. From the standpoint of the members of this chapter, the election outcome is being manipulated by which members are choosing to run. Last, if all the chapters in this national organization never elect a just right candidate like B, then the National Council will consist only of 2 low A's and 2 high C's. One is likely not to get a just right policy out of such a national council, but either a policy members of the organization in the main think is too low or too high. That policy is going to be selected by whichever faction has the majority in the council at a given time. But if you choose an election system that will always elect B, none of these bad things will happen. Drum roll. Instant runoff, which is approved to be used in Alaska, is one of the systems that never elects B. Now, mind you, if I lived in Alaska, I would have voted for the reform there in a heartbeat for reasons to become clear. But it is not the best election system available. You may ask, how does B lose under instant runoff? When every voter ranks a candidate with a level closer to theirs over a candidate further away, which is certainly the natural thing for voters to do, it turns out that A and C in this election each get a bit more than 1/3 of the first place finishes counted on their ballots, and so B loses on the first round of instant runoff. That B is always ranked second by everyone who doesn't rank him first is simply not taken into account by that election system. Now, if this aspect of instant runoff is new to you, or if you knew about it but thought no system could avoid it, then please do some study before you copy the Alaska model. The alternative systems that always elect B, they are the Condorcet compatible systems. Long known, they adopt as a key principle that the ballots show that there is one candidate whom the voters would prefer to each of his rivals. Had only two candidates run, then that candidate should be elected. In the present case, the ballot show members prefer B to candidate A and prefer B to candidate C by margins of almost 2-1, and so B would easily be elected in any such system. I have a 130-page set of 4 papers out for review that examine the political electoral consequences of instant runoff and Condorcet-compatible methods in detail, which in fact are available to you in draft form, not final form yet, as part of this conference. So who am I to offer you this advice? Well, I am a physicist turned political reformer. I'm one of a handful of people responsible for the passage in California of nonpartisan primaries, and hence my strong support of the Alaska reform. I've also been part of certain other reforms. Now, California, after its nonpartisan primary, restricts the number of candidates in a general election to 2. And my research arose out of the COVID-19 shuttering of my physics laboratory, and I wish to know if having 3, 4, or more candidates in a general election in California would be better, as some people in California have begun arguing that it would be. Now, when I early said I was responsible for certain political reforms, I meant I have spent more than $25 million of my own money, and for the reforms I've been part of other than nonpartisan primaries, I oversaw their drafting and directed their statewide campaigns for the various ballot propositions. I've also filed briefs in the defense in the California and in the U.S. Supreme Courts. Now, with that experience I give you, that all these reforms I've been part of, I knew were compromises before I undertook them. So I well understand the need to pass a good reform instead of to fail to pass a better reform. But before you try to pass instant runoff another stage, you need to look at the Condorcet-compatible systems first, so you know what really is the better reform that you are giving up, and so you can make an informed decision about whether giving it up is necessary in order to pass a reform. Thank you.
If we were to wipe the slate clean and to create a system of governance that really centers people of color, particularly Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, what system would really lift up those voices to make sure that those concerns were heard?
The right to vote is a fundamental bedrock of American democracy, and it is a crucial tool in the ongoing battle against systemic racism.
The biggest problems in Metro Atlanta, specifically areas with higher Black populations.
As the primaries have highlighted, race is certainly a factor in our election system. Is this truly a government by the people, for the people? And if not, could a more representative, multi-party democracy help get us there?
The two-party system in the United States, we believe, is a major contributor to structural racism.
George Cheung runs More Equitable Democracy, a nonprofit focused on racial equity in elections. He says that our winner-take-all system, dominated by 2 main parties, has historically underserved communities of color.
Really, there is one party that is just generally hostile to anything related to racial equity and believes, generally speaking, that they have no way to attract more votes of color. So they just pretty much do anything they can to undermine the participation of communities of color. And then the other party pretty much can say, we're here for you, we're not them, we're better, so who else do you have to vote for? And so that creates a really untenable situation where people of color feel like they really have no choice.
Congress is more diverse than ever, yet just over 20% of voting members are racial or ethnic minorities, in a country where about 40% of the population is non-white. The history of the Oval Office speaks for itself. Issues of voting inequities have repeatedly become lawsuits between Democrats and Republicans. In 2018, the Supreme Court held in place Texas voting maps that Democrats argued weakened the growing voting power of minorities. A year later, the court barred challenges to partisan gerrymandering altogether. George argues that a potential solution would be a proportional, multi-party system for the U.S. House of Representatives, where instead of a winner-take-all between a Democrat or Republican, candidates from, say, 4 to 5 parties would compete and hold power. the number of seats allocated proportionally to the votes won by each party. This kind of representation would be similar to the systems in Ireland and Australia. Candidates for those parties could also compete for US Senate seats and the White House using ranked choice voting, where voters list out their preference in order, and the winning candidate is determined by rank. These elections would not be proportional, though, since the offices are designed for single winners.
We probably would still have a center-left political party at Democrats. We would have a center-right political party. I would call them an old school Republican Party that really doesn't exist anymore. We probably would have a Tea Party or other very nationalistic party further to the right, and then maybe one or two parties further to the left.
Ain't no power like the power of the people, because the power of the people don't stop. Say what?
I think that this would provide an opportunity for a new party that really truly embraces racial.
Say what?
I think that this would provide an opportunity for a new party that really truly embraces racial equity as its main value. Two-party system.
Minority political parties have historically existed, but their success in elections is often fleeting. Take the Raza Unida Party in the 1970s, which was comprised of Latinx political leaders in Texas and other southwestern states.
They were able in certain city councils to win all of those seats because they were the majority. But once again, the challenge of a winner-take-all system puts pressure for those small political parties to really try to contest within the structure of the two-party system, as opposed to really blossoming and being able to really embody the hopes and dreams of communities of color because they have a path to building real political power.
There's no constitutional precedent for a two-party system. In fact, it doesn't say anything about political parties at all. George Washington went so far as to speak out against them, but by the time he left office, two parties had formed, and we've operated that way ever since.
If we really think about the challenges that we face in terms of reconciling with our racist history, having an electoral system that is at its core, it's about who sets the agenda.
Well, for some reason, that has stopped, but it was very near the end. So just to wrap up, we as More Equitable Democracy are really focused on achieving proportional representation to achieve a multi-party system so that there really is more competition for the votes of communities of color. And that's what we believe will really change our political system when the votes of color are seen as not really captured by one political party, but force multiple parties to vie for those votes and really incorporate racial equity into the platforms of multiple party platforms. So with that, I'd love to take any questions.
Hi, George. I have one question. I wanted to know if you have noticed any messaging differences the way that I have in getting communities of color to vote, depending on what community of color one is trying to reach. And have you seen more of a positive or a negative impact with that?
Well, I think that, in many times, if you are a person of color who lives in a predominantly a district that is predominantly people of color, it's so challenging to really make the argument that your vote counts because at least in the general election, the race has already been decided. So in that way, moving to a system of proportional representation where communities of color are assured based on their size, as long as they are more than a particular threshold, they're assured the ability to elect someone of their choosing, and therefore really all of their votes count. And so in that way, I feel like sometimes under a winner-take-all system, arguing or trying to move people of color around, hey, your vote matters, sometimes it feels very hollow because in many cases, it doesn't feel very true.
George, I had a question just thinking about what you've said. Tactically speaking, what are you doing to advance the idea of proportionate representation?
So there's a few things. I think that there's a number of cities that are considering proportional representation just as a good reform. But one thing that we're really focused on is advancing state-based voting rights protections. All of the West Coast has some form of originally established by California. And that allows for easier challenges at the local level to inequitable electoral systems. And through a partnership with the Metric Geometry Gerrymandering Group, we've been able to commission research that looks at various remedies under state voting rights acts, and have almost always pointed to a form of proportional representation as superior to trying to create individual single member majority minority districts.
Great, thank you.
Is there a version of proportional representation that makes sense to you for nonpartisan legislative bodies like maybe city councils?
Right. And in fact, this is an interesting question because in New York City had proportional representation at two levels, both at the city council level beginning in the 1930s and as well as the school board, which had it up until the 1990s, I believe. And so the way that New York City did it, this is a little bit of kind of back to the future. The way that New York City did it was that each borough had a certain number of seats, depending on how many voters cast ballots in the previous election. And then using a system of ranked choice voting called single transferable vote, you would just rank your choices, and then the top X number of candidates, let's say 4, would take seats. And then so in that way, it's been applied in a number of places. Sam mentions Albany, California as a jurisdiction that also just implemented a similar nonpartisan version of proportional representation or single transferable vote.
Thank you. Aside from the other policies that you've mentioned previously, do you know if the use of public financing in Seattle via democracy vouchers has had a positive impact, or any at all, on getting closer to equitable representation?
I certainly believe that the democracy vouchers pushes all the candidates to kind of leave no stone unturned, which often means looking at people of color, immigrants, as potential sources of funding. What would be even better is to have proportional representation or ranked choice voting with no primary, so that you don't have to run out of money to get through the primary and then have no public finance dollars for the general election.
Thank you very much. And for those who are interested, George is going to be joining a panel in about 15 minutes. And so we'll go much more in depth to the work that they're doing at his organization. So thank you very much, George.
Thank you.
I think at this point, we've got a couple more videos before we get to our last couple of speakers prior to the panel.
I'm an independent voter. Soy independiente.
I'm a Democrat.
I'm a Republican.
We don't see eye to eye on everything.
But here's something that just makes sense. When we have elections, every registered voter should have the right to vote.
There are 3.5 million voters in Florida like me who don't belong to a political party, and we can't vote in the primaries. 90% of races are decided in the primaries, and my tax dollars pay for them, but independents can't vote. That's just not fair.
Plus, the current system is not just bad for her, but it limits choices for Democrats like me.
And Republicans like me. I want to vote for the best candidate in the primaries, even if they're not from my party.
That's why we're voting yes on Amendment 3 this November. Amendment 3 lets all voters vote in an open primary. It's simple, it's fair, and should be the law.
So when it comes to improving Florida, the time has come to let all voters vote. Vote yes on Amendment 3.
Let all voters vote. Vote yes on Amendment 3.
Let all voters vote. Vote yes on Amendment 3. Dejar que todos los votantes voten.
I'm Dr. Jessie Fields, and I've been a leader for many years in the independent movement and the movement to reform and revitalize our democracy. I live and work currently in New York City under a partisan system. We have partisan primary elections in New York, and I have also in the past lived for many years and worked in Chicago, on the west side of Chicago, which has a nonpartisan open primary system. I am giving my wholehearted support to St. Louis approves, to St. Louis being able to change to a nonpartisan system with approval voting. It's an opportunity to open up our democracy, to revitalize our democracy, to take our system of government and elections out of the hands of the party insiders and put it in the hands of ordinary people. St. Louis has a long tradition of civil rights advancements. It has a very prominent African American community, and it also has a history of ongoing inequality. Opening up the political process would give us the opportunity to reform and change that injustice. It would give the people of St. Louis the right to vote in the primary elections, which right now independents cannot vote in, and an opportunity, most importantly, to bring people together beyond partisan divides, to cross those partisan, political, racial, economic divides that keep the people of St. Louis and so many other areas in our country and in our cities divided. We have to build bridges between diverse communities. Nonpartisan elections, open primaries, and approval voting, I think, helps us to make those changes.
Great, thank you. At this point, I think we have Aaron Hamlin, the Executive Director of the Center for Election Science, to talk about some of his reflections on the win in St. Louis.
Awesome, thanks, Greg. So the Center for Election Science, what we do is we empower people with voting methods that strengthen democracy. We have a particular focus on approval voting. For those of you who don't know what approval voting is, you simply select all the candidates that you want. Use a normal ballot. You just are allowed to select more than one, and the candidate with the most votes wins. So it's just simple addition. Interestingly, in terms of context, some of the folks that we partnered with in St. Louis, which we're very excited about, were folks who were in Show Me Integrity, who also attended one of the previous NANR events. So some exciting context on ways that we can build coalitions together through events like these. St. Louis itself had used, as was just described, closed primary, which is a bit unusual in cities. Most cities don't do that, and they use more nonpartisan elections. But St. Louis was a bit different. And within their closed primaries, they would also have winners that would win their primary with 32%. And because many of the major cities in the US are very democratically dominated, it was that person would de facto win the election. And so you basically had a winner with 32% of the vote because of their closed primaries. And so what we had done as a consequence is we had worked with the folks on the ground in St. Louis, Show Me Integrity, which some of those folks came together with a new group, STL Approves. We saw the issue there, and there were some complications there. So for instance, plurality voting was really required to be used in the general election. And so there were also some additional issues in St. Louis in terms of infrastructure, not being able to add additional voting machines. But because of approval voting simplicity, it really allowed itself to cater to even and really work around even within these limitations. And so the solution that we came up with, working with the community in St. Louis, was to use a nonpartisan open primary where anyone could run, regardless of party. And you would use approval voting to deal with the vote splitting that would inevitably occur when you're allowing all these folks to run together. And the top two would go on to the general election, and there you can use plurality voting because you only have two candidates. And as was brought up by Charles Munger before, when you have a crowded field, some voting methods can kind of struggle with that kind of scenario, but approval voting does a really nice job of getting that more consistent style candidate and actually preferring a Condorcet winner. So that's something for Charles to think about with cardinal systems. So we were really excited with this type of approach, and we worked together with the folks at Open Primaries, who were wonderful partners with this. So thank you specifically to Jeremy and John. And again, this is just kind of another opportunity to recognize ways that we can coordinate together to really achieve these big wins when our goals intersect. And in doing this on the ground, we brought in a lot of other key players within the community in St. Louis. So in particular, what was interesting is that in the election before, one of the ones that really pointed out there was some bad stuff going on. The winner who won with 32% was also a consequence of many people in the Black community having their vote split. And as a consequence, someone who doesn't represent that community, even here in a minority majority city in St. Louis, where there are so many members of the Black community, really were disserved under our former system. And so that person who won with 32% really wasn't representing their community. But we were able to really get together a lot of key community players, including the local League of Women Voters, both major papers within the city, including the paper representing the Black community, and also leaders and new leaders, in particular like Cori Bush, who is recently able to make her way to Congress. And as a result of all that collaboration at the local level and really bringing all these groups together and having this really flexible instrument that is not only simple, but does a great job at winner selection and really making sure that everyone gets their voice heard when they're running, and making sure that voters, when they're voting, that they're not just throwing their vote away, that even if their candidate's a win, they still get that accurate reflection of support. And as a consequence of this great campaign that we were all able to run together, the initiative passed by 68%. And so we were all very excited by that. And it's also interesting to note that the previous candidate who won with 32%, as an incumbent, decided not to run perhaps because the vote splitting advantage wasn't there anymore. And so we're really excited for the future of St. Louis and making sure that the voters themselves have a system and tool that helps to give them the representation that they deserve. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. I have a question. With the increase in voter turnout, especially compared to previous years amongst communities of color, that being across the entire POC span, do you see any trends that could possibly indicate an even bigger increase in elections to come?
Yeah, I mean, that's certainly a potential. And that, I think, one of the components that's really exciting about approval voting and being able to capture support from communities of color is that there can be a lot of, there's diversity of viewpoints in a number of communities. And the last thing that we want is to push down that diversity of viewpoints from any community. And so we really want to encourage a system that allows for all these viewpoints from all the communities to come to light. And so as our electorate changes and as these communities change, we want to make sure that folks are able to get these ideas represented by different candidates and not have people have to fear that the mere fact that a number of candidates that represent their community are running at the same time, that they shouldn't have to fear that, oh, well, that candidate shouldn't run because they're going to split the vote. And so we're excited by approval voting as a tool for those folks, so that they don't have to have those fears, so that if there are multiple people that represent their viewpoint, they can support those people, and that they can really make those folks stand out who really hit their tune the best. So.
Aaron, just thinking about approval voting tactically, are there scenarios where candidates discourage people from approving other candidates? So do parties, as an example, say, don't approve any other candidate other than our candidate?
Well, you can have candidates all day long until they're red in the face, try to get voters to do what they want. But ultimately, the decision is up to the voters. We can look, for instance, say to Fargo, North Dakota. In Fargo, North Dakota, previously candidates would win with, again, like 35% support. Is garbage elections when who knows who the right candidate really was. So, for instance, there they had a two-person seat, which is not perhaps the traditional focus of approval voting, but there was a two-person race that previously had an average vote per ballot of 1.8. So previously you could vote for up to 2. Now with approval voting, you can vote for as many as you want. And in that election, the average vote per ballot was 2.3. And it may look like, well, like there's not a big difference compared to what it was before, but those small differences can mean quite a large difference. So often the margin of victory isn't particularly huge between first and second, or wherever that threshold is for the person who wins. And so as a consequence,
Yes.
both of the candidates who won got more than 50% approval. So it made a huge difference in that election, even with that what might be perceived as a small jump. And the other component is making sure that even candidates who don't win, even with these kind of small jumps, can make, again, a huge difference in terms of the reflection of support that they get.
Sure.
And we saw that in that election too.
Terrific. Thank you. I think at this point, we are going to turn it over to Dan Howle. Dan is the president of the Independent Voter Education Fund and has been an active part of the IVN and IVC since really its founding. So Dan, take it away.
It's been over 10 years since California passed the trifecta, what I call the trifecta of election reform. We passed a reasonable term limit, 12 years in the legislature, and a combination of either house. We passed the top 2 nonpartisan open primary, and we adopted a citizens redistricting commission. So California now has had 10 years of experience with citizen-drawn districts, nonpartisan open primaries, and we are approaching for the first time the end of the first 12 years of term limits for legislators. Most of the California legislature in 2024 and 2026 will have achieved their 12 years in the legislature. Whether all of those things have been successful or not is kind of up for debate. I would argue that elections in California are significantly more competitive now, and more people have the ability to participate. But there's still a number of things that we would like to do that I think would make the system better. We're concerned in California that there may be an assault on the top 2 nonpartisan open primary. So we're getting prepared to take a very hard look at being ready to run and support a nonpartisan open primary combined with ranked choice voting, so that 4 candidates would advance from the primaries. And in the general election, there would be 4 candidates on the ballot with ranked choice voting. One of the big problems that has developed in California over the last 2 or 3 election cycles has been a significant effort, primarily on the part of the trade unions, to have organized ballot harvesting. And ballot harvesting has had a significant effect on the outcome of elections in the last 2 election cycles. One of the big problems with ballot harvesting, as we've seen it, is there's no ballot. You can't ballot track with, and so that there's no custody of chain of custody with a ballot. People are allowed now in California to harvest and turn in as many ballots as they can. And there are examples of people turning in hundreds, if not thousands of ballots, particularly in Southern California, LA County. So we would like to try to figure out a way of restricting or eliminating ballot harvesting. We think it's really important for the integrity of the elections, and for people to have confidence in the fact that they can vote, and they can vote at home, and that their vote is going to count, and it's actually going to, if they hand it over to somebody, they're never sure if it's actually going to get delivered or altered. And so that's one of the things that we have great concerns about, and we want to try and figure out what we can do about rectifying that situation. The other thing that we're going to do, we have legislation that's been introduced in California that will change the way the presidential primary election is voted on in California. Right now, in spite of the fact that we were able to get nonpartisan open primaries in legislative and congressional races, we were not able to do it for the presidential election. And what we're going to try to do, we have legislation that will create a separate ballot for independent voters in California. So that as an independent voter in the presidential election, you would receive a ballot and would have every candidate from every party listed on your ballot. You would, as an independent, you would still have the option of either re-registering or choosing a ballot from any party that would allow you to choose a ballot. We would not force the political parties to count the ballots of independent voters in the process of choosing their electors for their national conventions. But as of this time, the Democratic Party allows independents to take a Democratic presidential ballot, and we feel very strongly that both political parties, both major political parties, and hopefully smaller political parties, would see the value of using the independent voters and the ballots that they cast to help choose their electors. California, as many people know, have moved their presidential primary election up until March because they want to be a significant player. They want to have more influence on what's happening on the national level in choosing the nominees for president. And I can't think of a better way for California acts to be relevant than to let the rest of the country know what independent voters in California think and who the candidates they think should be on the ballot in November running for president. So that's kind of where we are in California. We've accomplished some things, but I think there's a lot of cleanup to do. There's a lot more work to do. And we're going to keep plugging away at it. We've had some significant success at the local level, particularly in San Diego. We're going to keep working there. So if there's any questions, please fire away.
Yes. Hi, Dan. Would a top 4 or top 5 in California be a ballot initiative? And if so, how much money do you feel that would a campaign like that require?
It would be a ballot initiative. It probably would take $2.5 to $3 million to qualify, and probably another $6 to $8 million to fund a viable campaign. So I think you're looking in the neighborhood of $8 to $10 million.
Okay.
That's less than that's less than was spent on the nonpartisan top 2 primary that we passed in 2010 that went into effect in 2012. But I think people now have had experience with the nonpartisan primary, and so I don't think that is as big a difficult sell as it was the last time around. I think people have experienced it, they're comfortable with it, but again, we think that the trade unions may run in a repeal of the nonpartisan top 2, and so we would be, I think we would be ready and willing to go and change the existing system to a nonpartisan top 4 with ranked choice voting.
Do you feel that there are any positive impacts of the top 2 that has been implemented in California since 2010?
Of course, the top 2, basically what happened in California when we implemented the top 2 nonpartisan primaries, California's primaries and elections went from the least competitive in the United States to the most competitive. We are giving people, one of the things that it's difficult to get people to understand, but if you are a Democrat in a very Republican district, historically your vote in the general election really didn't count. If there was a Republican on the ballot, the chances of that person, the Democrat winning in a very Republican district were very slim to none. What's happened and what's changed is in those kinds of districts, the minority party voters and independent voters are the ones who really make the final decision. When you have 2 Democrats or 2 Republicans on the ticket in November, which is the result of the top 2, the independents and the minority party in that district, really at the end of the day, their vote now counts more than it's ever counted before. And it is that group of voters is the most important. So I think if there's any significant change that's happened, it's in districts where the minority party voters really have never had an opportunity to have an impact on the race. They do now, and there are numerous instances where the winner of the Democratic primary or the Republican primary did not win the general election when they ran against someone from the same party. And most of those cases, if you go back through and you do an analysis of the election, it's because the person who came in first in the primary did not do a good enough job to reach out to the independents and the minority party in that district. So I think that's more than anything else, the top 2 nonpartisan primary has given people in those kinds of districts a voice that they've never had before.
Thank you, Dan. That's a great point to end on. I think at this point we have one final video, and then we'll get to our afternoon panel before our networking event.
No matter how well funded and how well managed any one of these organizations are, you're never going to achieve major political democratic reform unless they work together.
So I feel like organizations like this, I mean, this is my first time here, can help facilitate bringing these organizations together, aligned on common goals, to have a greater impact.
We all have that sort of advocate fatigue at times. And then the next thing I'd say is but that doesn't matter. You have to keep doing the small things day in and day out. You have to keep leaning on each other, creating the alliances that we're seeing here at the Bridge Alliance, and making sure that we're not doing this work alone in silos, and that when we come together and we can all tackle those issues one by one, it's going to slowly become a domino effect, and we're going to start seeing real change.
We're doing this work because we enjoy it, because we want to be together, because it's fun and it's enjoyable, and we're having it be playful in the way that we're creating and co-creating change and shaping change together.
We basically want to include everyone, to empower everyone in order to make our world a better place, and I'm all about it.
During times of difficulty in the Bible, people gather together, and we gather together to make it through the hard things. And I see that's what the Bridge Alliance is. It's a gathering of people across all diversities. It's not just liberal. This isn't a liberal thing or a conservative thing, not even just an American thing. It's a human thing, and it's beautiful.
Terrific. Now I think it's time for our panel portion. First, I'm going to briefly introduce each of the panelists and ask them to spend 1 minute explaining a little bit about their organization and what they're trying to get accomplished broadly, so that there's some context when they answer the various questions. First, and we heard from him just a little while ago, is George Cheung, the Director of More Equitable Democracy. George, do you want to just spend 1 minute giving us a brief update on the 3 sort of areas where you're focused?
Yes, thanks so much. The 3 areas for our organization, once again, More Equitable Democracy is focused as a racial justice organization on electoral systems reform. First is state-based voting rights protections that allow for experimentation and particularly advancing proportional representation. The second is capacity building, particularly around people of color-led organizations, so that they have the ability to engage in a leadership role on reform campaigns. And third, narrative work, to make these kind of heady, abstract ideas much more accessible to the everyday person.
Terrific, thank you. The next person I'm going to introduce is a newly elected Representative Kyle Bailey from Maine, who's also the founder of RCV Strategies and really one of the principal architects of Maine's ranked choice voting initiative over the past several years. Kyle?
Hey, it's great to be with you, Greg. So I, as Greg said, have worked on ranked choice voting since 2014 in Maine, when we launched an effort here to put ranked choice voting on the ballot to see if Mainers thought like we did with my colleague Kara McCormick and Dick Woodbury at the time, former state senator, with no money in the bank, and didn't really even know if there were folks who thought like us. And it turned out very quickly that folks did, and we put an issue on the ballot and ran a grassroots campaign and won. And then that started the long, epic journey to protect ranked choice voting, expand it for the presidential election, and it's an ongoing process here to protect and expand. And we're looking at exciting opportunities here in the Maine legislature with myself and my newly elected colleagues to continue to work here in Maine and help folks all across the country. In Minnesota, where we just won 2 ballot measures at the local level, I've worked with Gene Massey in Fairhope, Minnesota there, and helping folks all across the country win ranked choice voting. So it's an exciting time for the issue and for our movement.
Terrific. Thank you, Kyle. Next, I want to introduce John Pudner. John is the director of Take Back Our Republic, which is frankly one of the few reform organizations that's really focused on conservatives. John, would you like to introduce yourself and your organization?
We are mainly former Republican operatives, and I'd say we aren't the Lincoln Project. To sum it up, probably I'd say our principals are all still rooting for all the Republicans when they run against Democrats. But we've tried to show some rank and file Republicans how these reform issues are really win-wins. For example, ranked choice voting, we've made a big push for, pointing out it can empower third-party independents, but it can also eliminate these token candidates that are basically hired by the other party just to peel off some votes. All that comes out in the laundry and ranked choice. We've been happy to point out that when you're losing the money war, 10 billion to 5 billion like this year, maybe having no limits on money is not in your advantage. So I think there's some money in politics issues. And then we also want to thank, Republicans who do the right thing. 106 Republican members of Congress signed on to the Texas suit challenging the election results. We spent all day today thanking the others who didn't sign on. We want to encourage that behavior. So, we do think we have a bit of credibility with some Republicans who are independent minded and can see the advantages of these nonpartisan reforms.
Terrific. Thank you, John. And last but not least, we have Lucille Winnegium, the Director of Communications and PR at the National Vote at Home Institute. Lucille?
Hi, everyone. I'm Lucille Winnegium. I am the Director of Communications and PR at the National Vote at Home Institute. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization dedicated to making sure that every American can vote in a safe, secure, accessible, and equitable election. And our sort of theory of change around that is primarily through vote at home systems. Obviously, mail-in ballots, voting by mail, absentee, all of those sort of terms under the umbrella of voting at home for us, and really advocating for that in all 50 states and in DC as a form of election administration and a proxy for access in a very real way. And so huge year, as I'm sure all of us know, but yeah, extremely exciting to be here and to talk about this really monumental year for election administration at large, but particularly voting by mail. And for us, we operate in sort of 4 big buckets. I would say the first is policy and advocacy. So really making sure that the policy that goes forward is really clean, really clear, and puts voters first. Making sure that we're bringing as many people along as we can in a really nonpartisan, cross-partisan way. Our second bucket is around research. So really wanting to dive deep into how people engage with mail ballot systems, voting systems at large. Our third bucket is around implementation. And so really wanting to focus on how election officials interact with the system and bring voters into voting, making sure that that policy actually works in real life. And then the fourth bucket is definitely going to be around the voter experience. So how are we lifting up the stories of voters when they're good, when they're having good interactions with their voting experiences, but then also when they are encountering barriers and hurdles, and how can we create voting systems that really focus on the voters' needs and make it as easy as possible and as secure as possible to engage with those systems.
Terrific. Thank you very much. I think we'll start, and I will start by asking a series of questions, but to the extent that anybody who's watching would like to ask questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A and I'll try to work them in. First, a basic question: how do we make reform, and you can speak to it from the point of view of the reform that you're advocating for, more relevant to voters who might think of it as very much a process-oriented question? And why don't I start with you, Kyle, as someone who's been involved with a number of campaigns over the last half a dozen years?
Sure. Well, I think I'd say three things. I think sort of the relentless voter education is important, and consistently putting the issue in front of voters, whether it's ranked choice voting or top four or vote at home, consistently letting voters know that there's a different way of doing things. Because I think that most voters are familiar with the way in which they participate in their democracy now. And they don't often think about the alternative ways to engage. And so when you let them know that there's a different way of doing it and a better way of doing it, and you consistently bring that issue to the forefront, I think it makes a big difference. And I think running sort of smart legislative and ballot measure campaigns at the state and local level that really meet voters where they are, that raise awareness about the reforms, that frame the problem and solution in a smart and sophisticated way, but also in a very clear and concise way, that the messaging is right, that you're connecting the dots for voters, I think is really, you make a compelling case for why your reform is necessary is key. And then I think, organization and mobilization, and in a time of COVID, it's made it all the more difficult, but finding ways to get creative. I've always been a big believer in grassroots, and I think that is in no other issue is it more important than it comes to democracy issues, that we if we say we're about our reforms are inevitably about empowering voters and making our democracy stronger, then we have to walk the talk, which is the work that we do to bring about the reforms that we're about has to be about bringing people into the process and having a democratized process where people are empowered and taking action and being at the decision-making table and helping to build the movement. That there really is a people-driven movement that over time, and we've seen it in Maine, it now gets to the point where an issue bubbles up around ranked choice voting in Maine, and I don't even need to try to recruit people to write letters to the editor. They just pop up because we've built that, and where people are empowered and they feel like they're part of a movement, and it's real. And I think that is really key.
Terrific. Say, Kyle mentioned the idea of smart and sophisticated messaging. So often, what I would observe about some of the messaging that we use is it fails to connect with people emotionally. And I know you've mentioned narrative storytelling as one of the things that you're doing in your organization, George, and Lucille actually mentioned it in her opening remarks as well. But maybe you could elaborate for us a little bit, George, on how you use documentary filmmaking to really build the narratives that allow people to emotionally connect with some of the reforms we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think that is really important to think about narrative, because it really meets people where they're at. And in terms of proportional representation, one interesting thing is that we have this kind of hidden history of the use of proportional representation in our country. that New York City implemented in the 1930s, that there was this whole progressive reform movement that ended up pushing this reform in a number of Midwestern cities, including Cincinnati. And it was done largely by reformers to give people who didn't have a voice in that system. And so I think that one thing that narrative can do is kind of shine a spotlight on our hidden history of who are the people of color that really led those efforts, who got elected and broke some glass ceilings to really represent their communities. There's other ways to kind of contextualize it. One other example that we've been really thinking deeply about is the challenges of representation for Native American communities. There's a couple of histories, including the Treaty of New Echota, which led to the Trail of Tears, but it actually provides the right for the Cherokee Nation to send a delegate to Congress, which they will actually do this next congressional session. Similarly, Maine has a recognition of a couple of federally recognized tribes to send non-voting delegates to the state legislature. So I think that there's ways of actually telling our own history that can really help empower and provide some deeper context for the challenges that lie ahead.
And Lucille, you mentioned it as well in your opening. Can you talk a little bit about how you're using the power of narrative at the Vote at Home Institute to really advance your cause?
Yeah, absolutely. It's huge for us. It really is, especially when you're thinking of reforms and the reform space as a voter-centric movement. You have to invest really heavily in narrative. And for us, that's looked like a couple of different things. The first was really leaning into our partner network. And we've been really blessed this year to be able to expand that network in a really huge way across the aisle. And I think someone in the Q&A mentioned that sometimes these reforms can feel attached to a certain party or a certain vehicle for success. But really for us, it's been about leading with the voters and voters across the spectrum and their experience, being able to lift that up in the narrative. So that's been really big for us to connect with partners in that way. And then what we do around that with a mix of both collaborative and focus polling that we're doing on our own is really being able to turn that into an amplification campaign, right? And so for us, that looked like nearly $4 million out in the field to reach voters where they were. And it wasn't about the races themselves. It wasn't about the candidates. And I believe it was Kyle earlier that was sort of talking about this through the paradigm of a campaign, but we really want to think of it as staying ready so you don't have to get ready, right? So how are you lifting the floor for voters, getting them engaged and keeping them engaged throughout their day-to-day experience, not just in a voting cycle, not when you have the noise of candidates also kind of in the sphere, right? How are you keeping civic engagement and the reform conversation relevant for voters throughout? And so for us, of course, 2020 election year, we're going quite big in that way, and we were able to reach about 60 million voters with that amount of money, and that was across 15 states that we were being really dedicated, where we felt that voters really needed to be able to hear the narrative, both from voters themselves and their experience, but also from election officials. One of the things that really shined for us in our polling, in our messaging, was how trusted a source election officials were in this process, and voters really wanted to hear from them what they were doing, how they were doing it, how it landed, so that they could feel really confident in the transparency of that process. And we saw that play out even as election officials established their own lines of communication, their own narratives with voters in a really big way. That's secretaries of states, that's election officers in these large jurisdictions connecting directly with voters, telling them, this is what's happening, this is how it's happening, this is why it's in your best interest and why you can feel confident in what's happening. And I think that's a huge thing for us to all learn in the reform space, is it's not just about the money. Voters aren't going to connect with that necessarily, that their state is going to perhaps save tens of millions of dollars. That's an abstract idea. But being able to talk about a voter's neighbor, being able to talk about their own routine, being able to talk about what is available for them is huge. And so when we're able to connect these huge reforms to these things that are really relevant in voters' daily lives, that's when we really make that change. And we saw that this year when huge swaths of voters had more access to voting by mail. It became the the most used method of voting. Obviously, there's a lot of other extenuating factors here with the pandemic, but what we learned was that even with this massive misinformation campaign, voters were able to take stock of what their options were, use the methods that were available to them, and feel really confident about that in the end.
Terrific, thank you. And John, you might actually have the most challenging messaging problem of all, trying to make reform something that's palatable to conservatives and Republicans. How has that challenge evolved in the last 4 years with President Trump in the White House?
Well, I think the central thing you have to do is simplify the choice for people and keep repeating it over and over. I'll give you the first example. The day that Trump won 62% of the vote in South Dakota, we won a ballot initiative there with 55%. And we did that by repeating one simple message. Because of the corruption in your state, you're paying an extra $1,300 a year because of just deals being cut for campaign donors. And everything sticks with that message. So when they came back and said, well, Koch brothers organization, was telling us we weren't really conservatives, they shouldn't vote for this, this was a liberal plot, our response stayed within the message. The Koch brothers, 9 of their 14 asphalt making plants surround your state. They bid on $250 million a year in road projects. That's why you're paying $1,300 more a year and getting less for it than you would be. And that's how you get a 55% reform vote with a 62% Trump vote on the same night, on the same ballot. My wife's a college philosophy professor, so she hates this, but it's just simplifying that message. The closer you're to an election, the less, the bigger narrative stories you need to tell between elections come into place. And you can just never be talking about your second or third best argument to win people over. You aren't winning them over to the whole movement during the election period. You're doing that once the election's over to build for next year. But simplify, simplify, simplify.
Terrific, thank you. It actually is consistent with the experience I had when I was doing a book tour and found that some of my best audiences around reforms were on conservative talk radio. Because if you made those reforms real for them in terms of the implications of having the system we have today on their everyday lives, it really resonated with them. So I'm glad to hear you're having similar experience. I'm going to take a couple of questions now from the Q&A. First one is to George, and I'll just read it to you. In an ever-growing recognition of the fact that we are almost all of mixed race, and again, feel free to refute the basis of the question if you would like. Creating a proportional representation seems a slowing down of the evolution of being colorblind. Please comment.
Wow. So I guess I don't agree with the premise that we are moving towards a colorblind society. I think that if we were, we wouldn't have this huge uprising in terms of the death of George Floyd and the impacts of racism in our criminal justice system. So that I have a very different opinion about it. But I think in general, proportional representation I think is really important because it addresses some major challenges with regard to structural racism and segregation. In order for people of color in a racially polarized voting situation to have political representation under current jurisprudence, you have to be able to be large enough to be the majority in a particular district in order to force, under the Voting Rights Act, a creation of a so-called majority-minority district, which creates huge impediments. There are communities of color that are too small to receive that protection, and others who, though they might get a majority-minority district drawn, it really limits their influence in the surrounding districts. So by moving towards proportional representation, we really are empowering communities across the board. We, as more equitable democracy, are focused on communities of color. But if you are, let's say, a renter, renters are typically lower income, don't vote at the same rates, and are usually hugely underrepresented. So whether or not you are a minority political or minority ethnic or racial group, proportional representation is a system that's fair for everyone.
Terrific. I'm going to go to one other question and then I'll go back to asking direct questions. The first, this one, there seems to be a bias in Democratic reform community towards the several dozen states with ballot initiative. What about the majority of states that don't have them? on issues such as open primaries, ranked choice voting, redistricting, where legislatures rarely have an interest in serious nonpartisan reform? Should we give up like the Democratic reform community has apparently done in practice, if not in theory? And Kyle, I'm going to direct this one to you.
That's a great question. No. So I'll give an example. I mentioned earlier Minnesota. This election cycle, there were 2 local ballot measures that passed in Minnetonka and Bloomington to win ranked choice voting. And there's a panel, or there's one of the workshops tomorrow Fair Vote Minnesota is doing, talking about their victories there. It is a legislative state, not a ballot measure state, in terms of moving towards ranked choice voting adoption statewide. In addition to doing the 2 local ballot measure states, two local ballot measures there, where they also have ranked choice voting that were won in local ballot measures in 3 other municipalities. It's part of their strategy. They also ran I think a pilot project that every reform community across the country should really be looking at right now, which is, for the first time ever, they really galvanized thousands of volunteers across the state to work on candidate campaigns and PAC work, and actually participated in C4 tables and ponied up resources to engage and work with political shops and sophisticated campaign operations to work to elect pro-voter, pro-democracy reform, pro-ranked choice voting candidates. And they were considered serious political players. And, I saw some of the emails and communications from candidates who won and some who came close and lost afterwards, communicating back to that organization that said, we would not have won had it not been for the ranked choice voting volunteers, or we would not have come as close as we did had it not been for the ranked choice voting volunteers. And there were people in the party apparatuses who said the same thing to Fair Vote Minnesota. So, that is sort of groundbreaking work happening in Minnesota right now, that if you're in a legislative state, you ought to be looking at what Fair Vote Minnesota is doing, because it is sort of laying the groundwork for how do you win in a state that is legislative. And you got to engage in not only educating legislators and at the legislative level, but doing the political work that's necessary to elect pro ranked choice voting, pro open primaries, pro vote at home candidates. I think that it's a part of the sophisticated strategy that it might ultimately take for you to win your reform there, depending on the political climate, depending on the composition of your legislature, and whether there is existing support for your issue, or whether you need to build support, and whether that the equation requires that you pragmatically roll up your sleeves and engage in the difficult work of electing candidates who will become champions for you in the legislative process, because you need champions, and you need enough of those champions. And by the way, you also need champions in leadership, because different legislatures work different ways. Some are more democratic, little d democratic than others, and some aren't very little d democratic at all. And so you got to have friends, and that's where it really is important to get smart about politics and to hire good lobbyists and to build not only teams of grassroots folks outside the state house who you can leverage political power from the constituency level, but be able to have a good political strategy for inside the state house as well, in addition to doing your electoral strategy work. So I'd take a look at and talk to Jean Massey, because she's a real powerhouse in Minnesota for how you do smart political work when it comes to doing work in legislative states.
Thank you very much. One final question for John before I ask a question about 2020. When you're mobilizing conservatives to support nonpartisan political reform, do you typically see that lead to conservatives and liberals working together in the effort? If so, what are the strategies you've found most helpful to get people with divergent ideologies to work together? John, that one's for you.
Yeah, I'd hate to say that's a little further down the road usually, and this kind of actually ties into Representative Bailey's last answer. When you're in a legislative state, what we're doing is getting Republican voters to call Republican officials to tell them they want to pass something. So in Georgia, we made a lot of progress last year on ranked choice voting. We were talking to Republican leadership. We were talking to Republican officials. We were making sure each of them got 100, 150 calls from their home district. but none of those calls came from Democrats. Let me put it that way. You don't need someone getting on the phone with the legislator and then end up arguing about 3 other issues. And so that's just playing within the system right now. That's how do you advance something? And I think we had a real shot if COVID hadn't hit. We're getting close to a study committee and moving on that. So unfortunately, the initial game is what it is. I mean, you need people to hear from people who are like-minded on other issues that then kind of surprise them and say, hey, and one thing we really need is ranked choice, or we need nonpartisan commissions, or we got to put some limits on this money. Come on, we're getting overwhelmed. But oh, by the way, I agree with you on your other 6 issues and helped you get elected last time. I mean, that's the call you want. And that's what replaces the referenda. It's the grass tops, grassroots, where the elected official starts viewing their next election as contingent on agreeing with things that in another state you can pass with initiative and referendum.
Thank you. Very, very insightful. Lucille, one question for you, which is the pandemic in 2020 obviously had wide-ranging repercussions across our country, our economy, et cetera. How did you see it impact the work you were doing at the Vote at Home Institute?
To say that it completely rejuvenated us is an understatement, to say the least. When it comes down to it, we really double down on the principles and the methods that we've always really prided on, making sure that we are putting voters first, making sure that we are supporting election officials to do the work, making sure that we are amplifying voter voices, and keeping our work what I like to call aggressively nonpartisan. So we stuck to our guns, but really the scope of this work exploded for us. And so we were able to see movement in places that had just been quite a bit stuck. And, thinking toward 2021, a lot of what we'll be doing is trying to make sure that voters continue to have those levels of access that they have gotten this year, but then also making sure that people do know the security measures that are involved, that they do know the different pieces that are involved here, so that it's not a zero-sum game in terms of both accessibility and security. That's really big for us going into 2021. But thinking about 2020, we went into action quite quickly. So right around March 15th, we released our scale plan. Our CEO, Amber McReynolds, who I believe spoke earlier, really piloted that, and it was the first plan of its kind to really show folks how people could conduct really safe and secure elections during a pandemic, making sure that voters had access to all of their options, whether voting in person was the best thing for them, whether voting early was the best thing for them, or voting by mail and returning whatever way that they wanted. So what that looks like at scale, and we were talking a lot about ballot measures, but really in March, we were looking at a very diverse array of ways that folks could do this. And so that looked like policy in the places where legislative sessions were still happening, that looked like executive orders in other places, that looked like election officials and boards of elections really leading on process. So there were lots of different levers of change at that point. And so our scale plan really laid out the various ways that states could do this, both from a logistical level, or I should say a legislative level, a policy level, but then also the logistical level. So making sure the election officials knew the various ways that they could scale as well, whether that be machinery or looping in poll workers. As we all know, there was a pretty severe poll worker shortage toward the middle of the year, which thankfully was recouped by the end. And all of these various pieces, especially communications. I know we talked about narrative earlier. I'm naturally very biased, but communications was a big place where we knew that election officials were going to continue to need support. And then as we moved into the summer, thinking about the federal funding fight and really making sure that the elections infrastructure had the real resources that it needed to be able to continue to be resilient. And these are the things that, when we're thinking about reform, obviously, some years you get an interesting year like 2020, right? But we knew that some of these vulnerabilities have always been there. We know that voters stand in lines for forever and become disenfranchised because of that. We know that shift workers like physicians and other folks aren't able to participate in the system in a single day in-person model, right? So we knew that these things weren't the most resilient ways of doing this. And so being able to look at it through that lens and then also have sort of the frame of COVID around that it gave us the opportunity to be really imaginative with how we did this and how we got this to folks. And it made us really collaborative as well. So through the summer, we worked with folks across the political spectrum as well to make sure that whichever voters they were talking to, regardless of the ideology that they were speaking to, they had a good understanding of the policy landscape and the mechanics, so that they were able to engage folks as quickly and as efficiently as possible, and to really support the infrastructure that election officials were running. And then, of course, going into the general election, making sure that we were helping election officials close the gap, because we know federally election officials only receive $300 million when what they really needed was closer to $1.2 billion. So, you know, especially in the reform space, we tend to talk about how much money is needed to move these things. And so making sure that election officials got what they needed, just really practical things like how are you scaling up your counting operation? How are you creating transparency within your system so that people can feel really confident about the outcome. So for us, it was multi-pronged, continues to be multi-pronged, but going into 2021, it's a really different ballgame. We again have more voters this year who have voted by mail than any other method of voting, which is astounding. We have I'm going to go into a few more stats here really quick. 12 states that switched from requiring an excuse to not requiring an excuse. 43 million voters who 43 million voters is what that looks like in states. 30 states that we personally, as an organization, were able to consult on policy, and then 48 million voters that were able to track their ballots as well. So again, going back to that safety, security, transparency, these are common sense measures that we continue to advocate for with election offices, to make sure that voters feel really confident about these reforms, and so that they know that it's not just about the pandemic. That is obviously the sort of proxy movement here, but it's about what does that look like? What do resilient election systems look like? Do they look like making sure that voters are able to vote over a longer period of time? Yes. Does it look like more flexibility for voters? Yes. Does it look like making sure that if you voted for someone in a primary and who drops out of a race before you get to cast your ballot, that you're still able to have your best intention reflected? Yes. So COVID was definitely huge for us. And one of those things where we really wanted to make sure that voters were safe. That was the core of it. And we knew that we had a really great reform that was able to really insulate voters and all of the people that were working in election infrastructure.
Terrific, thank you. We've got time for a couple more questions. And what I'm gonna do on this next one is ask everybody to give their top answer, try to limit it to 45 seconds to a minute so we can get to the last question. But the first question I will have for you, and we'll go in order that I introduced you, what do you think the biggest learning, what's the number one learning you had coming out of your efforts in 2020? And George, we'll start with you.
Great, thanks. I would say that the biggest, I'd say a couple of things, that people demand representation. It's clear that the mass protests fueled by the death of George Floyd is a good example that people are angry and they want better representation. The second is that even though that people of color in particular turned out in huge numbers, that doesn't really translate into real representation. This goes back to the challenges of the winner-take-all system, whereby people of color largely are segregated and only majorities in urban areas, and therefore limiting their own representation. So I think that there's this moment of awakening of, wow, our system is really broken. And even though we turned out in record numbers, that doesn't mean that we have more political clout.
Terrific, thank you. Kyle? And I apologize, Kyle, I'm gonna start saying Representative Bailey. It's just old habits die hard.
Nope, Kyle's fine. The sort of lessons learned, I think messaging is really important. And I just keep, the more and more I practice politics, and the more challenging and the more sort of cluttered our lives become. I mean, we're just inundated from so many different directions with so many different messaging. And so it becomes all the more important to get it right out of the gate, and to deliver it as clearly and concisely, because it is just very hard to reach voters, and you don't always get as many opportunities as you like, especially with some of our issues. And so I think communicating those messages well, and getting that message right, and delivering it over and over and over and over and over again as well as possible is really important. And I saw that in Bloomington and Minnetonka, especially this year with the local ballot measures. I mean, we really worked hard to refine our messaging with some mail pieces we did, which we're going to talk about a little bit tomorrow on one of the workshops. And it made a big difference for us, and delivering that through digital as well, and reinforcing that. I think also the importance of the sort of homegrown efforts, and I already knew that through Maine, that it was Maine people doing it, but Bloomington and Minnetonka were Bloomington and Minnetonka people. Alaskans were Alaska people, and maybe some of the money came from elsewhere to support it, but it was Alaska people and Maine people and local people who knew their communities guiding that strategy, even if they had smart political people from other places providing advice and input. It really needs to be local people on the ground who know their communities guiding the work, and not people flying in or conferencing in from DC or New York telling people what to do, because that doesn't work. And that's not anything new, but these elections just reinforce it for me. And then I think just the importance of the grassroots. The loss in Massachusetts of ranked choice voting was tough, and I think one of the challenges there was not being able to get out and knock on doors and show people the ballot and have the conversations. And I think you saw that with issues in some places, but you also saw with candidates too. I think that issues require education, and especially if you've got an issue that voters don't know and your opponents just have to play on a seat of doubt. And I think that's why it's all the more important to get out there and educate voters. And that's really hard to do in a pandemic, but it's a reminder of the importance of face-to-face interaction with voters, and really explaining the issue and why it matters, and not losing sight of that. And that, I think that's, in a digital age, it's really important for us not lose sight of the human connection, to get out there and organize and have conversations with people.
Right. And John, if you were to identify one of your biggest learnings from 2020, what would that be?
One of the best compliments we were getting this year was we seem to be the only group that really was concerned about both voter suppression and voter fraud. And I just encourage everyone to think of both of those things. There's no voter fraud at all that exists, and any security step you take is just really an attempt at suppression. I think is harmful. And so let me say, I've gone to great extent to mathematically shoot down every conspiracy theory on the election being stolen. I mean, I've gone in great detail to that, even with donors funding it. So let me say that as a preference. That being said, though, this idea that there's no voter fraud out there, you just, particularly when you're trying new systems, when you're mailing things for the first time to everyone, you do have to be concerned about safeguards. I mean, Utah does mail-in ballot voting beautifully. I've sat in their rooms. There's electronic match on signatures. Things don't sneak through on them. I did really question Nevada just mailing ballots to everyone when they'd never done mailing ballots, not applications, which I supported, which was done in a lot of states, because I've knocked on too many doors and I've seen, where 10 people are registered at the same door, and, you get 10 ballots there. One of our staffers actually had called someone to note they'd voted more than once and that this was illegal. And they said, well, if the state didn't want me to vote 3 times, they wouldn't have sent me 3 ballots. Now, that person's not part of a nefarious conspiracy, but I'm just saying there's a trial and error here. And I just hope people don't have the resistance to trying to fine tune, mail-in balloting, and, is mailing applications to everyone appropriate, but not putting 5 million ballots on the street the same day when people are throwing them around. I mean, that does lead to any 2-bit fraudster, going out and doing some nefarious things. So I just encourage that. And the other one I'll bring up, I'm sure this is sensitive for some on the call, but voter ID was an 80% issue by 2016 in ballot. It's hitting 90% support now. So I know there's some reservations on it, but for me, there's signature match on mail-in, there's voter ID at the ballot box. You can argue against it, but I just want to say you're putting yourself with the 15% furthest on the left if you're against voter ID. So I'd like to keep an open discussion on all these things, even the ones that I know some of my friends disagree with me on.
Well, I think that's helpful though, John, because I think the key to pulling in Republican support for a number of these initiatives are probably first to try to understand what the reticence is and don't view it through a lens of negative intentions, but rather say, there's a concern here and let's see if we can't calmly address the concern and address it in an appropriate way. So I appreciate you saying that. Lucille, what's the biggest lesson you learned from 2020? And then we'll have one final question and allow everyone to get ready for the networking event.
Sure. I think the biggest thing that we took away from 2020 was around partisanship in the process and how that can really spoil how people feel about the process overall, the process of voting, the process of having your voice counted, and really how that can erode our democracy. And so for us, that obviously took a few different forms. I think the biggest one that continued to be surprising for us was the huge amounts of mis and disinformation and the real inability to be able to pierce that in certain places and be able to even to just lay out the facts and be able to add some scale to some of the things that were out there. That was quite difficult and quite surprising. So making sure that we continue to talk more about the process rather than who wins and who loses, and really not relying on the folks who have the most to gain from how the process is structured, aka the people that get elected, who have the most to gain from things running a certain way, being the ones who have the loudest megaphones about how it works. So that would definitely be our biggest thing. And just to speak to what John was saying, absolutely agree in that we have to be able to have a really balanced conversation about accessibility and security, and not making sort of unequivocal statements, but really being able to speak to things with scale. And I think this also speaks to something that we've talked about earlier around narrative as well, wanting to be really open and honest about how these things work. There is a conversation to be had about, sending applications versus sending ballots. For us, for our organization, we're looking at it as a process standpoint. If you've got good voter rolls and you have that security and you know that is a way that you are keeping your election system secure, then it's actually extremely wasteful to go straight to do applications before doing a whole other round of mailing ballots. And like John said, you've got states like Utah who have done this really swimmingly. So there's definitely a conversation to be had about how you can blend those things, but that conversation also has to be rooted in what the system looks like today. And the system is quite safe today. There's room to talk about how to make it better. There's always room to refine. That's sort of the point of the reform movement. But really wanting to be able to speak in the realm of truth of what this actually looks like right now, what the processes are that are available to us to sort of choose from and innovate on, and kind of keep it moving and not be sort of stuck in who benefits the most from a system working a certain way, when we should all be focused on the voter benefiting the most and being the most confident in the fact that their voice is heard.
Thank you. One last question, and again, I'll try to ask everyone to limit it to about 45 seconds because I know we want to have a small break before we get to the networking portion of this. And this isn't to prejudge how you're feeling about the future, but what makes you optimistic about the efforts you're working on in 2021 and beyond? Again, 45 seconds or so would be great. George, what's the thing that makes you optimistic?
Part of the work that we're doing in 2021 is supporting people of color-led organizations and coalitions around the redistricting process. Keeping the status quo is not our jam, but it's really helpful in educating what the challenges are with the winner-take-all system. We did a presentation to some Oregon folks, and one person said, "Oh my gosh, this is terrible. It's like Sophie's Choice times 100. We need to do something different next time." So that makes me hopeful.
Representative Bailey, what makes you hopeful and optimistic about the future?
Yeah. So Kyle thinks that change is coming. Millennials are taking over, and the generation behind us is coming up, and we're embracing change, and we're not scared of ranked choice voting in these reforms. And I think we're seeing that play out in our politics. And a friend of mine just got elected to Congress. Her name's Nikema Williams. She succeeded the incredible, extraordinary John Lewis, and she's got big shoes to fill down in Georgia. And she just said in a piece last week, I've been talking to her for a couple of years now, that ranked choice voting is, one of the ways she's going to make good trouble. And I think she's a young leader. And I think more and more of these folks coming in through the system are going to be talking about these reforms as ways to make good trouble and make our democracy work better, because the way it's been working ain't working. And so we got to do better. And so I think younger folks get that. And as they age up and in, we're going to see some of these reforms really take off.
Yeah, I like to say that in my 2 elections, I'm reasonably certain I won the 12-year-old vote. So I'm optimistic about that as well. John, what makes you hopeful and optimistic for the future?
Well, it takes crisis to have change, and so I think we're at the greatest opportunity we've ever had based on the last few weeks. People are questioning whether or not some of these built-in things in the system work. And on the conservative side, it was really tough to argue money in politics post Citizens United for the first 5 or 6 years when Republicans were outspending Democrats heavily. Both sides are going to learn to play the game. And I do sense there's a growing sense of the things that are good for, say, political consultants or some of the wrong kind of election lawyers that they make a lot of money on. Those people are advocating for things not because they help a particular party win, but because they make a lot of money. And these solutions are going to make things more grassroots. So I think there is a very healthy side to the populism that has happened over the last few years that has challenged both parties. There are certainly downsides too, we've seen, but I think that's going to create the ability for change, because the rank and file across the spectrum wants these kind of changes once they get them, and I think we're heading there.
Great, thank you. Lucille, what makes you optimistic about the future?
Yeah, this might be a bit counterintuitive, but I spend a decent amount of time on the internet, and even though there are some super loud voices out there, I think the vast majority of people are really excited to look at the way that we run elections, the way that we vote, the way that we participate differently. And I think regardless of why you were compelled to vote this year or how engaged you ended up being, I think that we were really in a year where you heard about voting as a way to participate, a way to make change, a way to be an American in a way that we've never heard before. And the baseline has really been elevated on the consciousness around this form of participation. And so that's definitely one thing that's really excited me. And I think that when we get into the conversation, once we sort of peel back the layer of partisanship, of, what's still running here, who's still running there, who's won, those sorts of things, you really get into the meat of it, which I think is that people are excited to participate. They're excited to be a part of this. And what we're really excited to do is to help them get there, to help them be part of this process, and to be to have a feeling of investment in this process, investment in these changes. And that's the way that we get people ultimately enfranchised with reform, is we get them invested in this. And so that's what makes me excited.
That's great. And I think I'll end just by saying I'm optimistic about the future, because having watched this movement over 10 years, I realize, particularly as I've heard all of the presentations today, that we have grown the leadership in this movement. We have grown the number of people who are getting actively involved in campaigns. And I think we've started to create the conditions that are ripe for change. And I'm optimistic that we're approaching a tipping point, and with any luck, we will get there, and we will get to a point where we have a government that's not only more representative of our people, but ultimately more committed to solving problems, and recognizes that their first obligation isn't to get reelected. Their first obligation is to improve the lives of Americans. And if they're unwilling to embrace that, we will have systems that ensure healthy competition, ultimately put somebody in that role who is. And so I'm optimistic because I've seen this movement grow from something very small to something that I think is now becoming quite impactful. And I'm excited for the future, and thank all of you for participating on the panel, and all the panelists who presented today. I think at this point we're going to probably cut to some music, give everybody a little break, and then they've got a social hour planned. So again, thank you all for participating in the panel, and enjoy your break.